His obsession with Wallace had given him an excuse to renounce the role of king, which he had increasingly not wanted. Harry? Now, of course, Harry never had a chance at the throne, which is why his blubbering and crying about life was even worse than I would even say that David's was, because, David really did have a weight on his shoulders, and I think very few of us would really want that responsibility. Harry wanted to blubber and cry because for why? Because he had a super well-off life where he got to pretty much do whatever, and then sometimes had to come out and be nice to poor people. Harry's complaints never made any sense. At least I can sort of see why David / Edward / the Duke of Windsor was a little bit unhappy about his lot in life. But we all need to rise to the challenges. We all have our cross to bear, and it just is like such a lame and childish excuse to be like, well, I don't want to do this. I'd rather go hang out with my girlfriend. Hello, welcome to the first episode of Traitor King. All right, so this is going to be a short chapter. It's the first chapter of this book, which basically just sets up the whole theme that he's abdicating, that he is choosing a different path, that he is on a complete different trajectory than the rest of the country would have wanted for him. He is in one emotional headspace. The rest of the family and city and country are in a completely different headspace. And just sort of like the juxtaposition of his goals and dreams and ideals versus what everybody else was facing. Everybody else is in tears, and he's like thrilled. He's somebody described him as like being like a schoolboy who is just ready to go on holiday. So it's very frustrating, really, to see how selfish he is. And I mean, it's Harry. This person was like the original Harry. His selfishness knows no bounds, and his like insistence that other people should understand why this is a necessity. Again, very much like Harry. It's sort of like, I think Harry and Edward would have been great friends. Now, we need to kind of talk about what we're going to call him this entire book, because he goes by many names, even in the first chapter. So we've got Edward, we've got David, we've got the Duke of Windsor, and sometimes just Windsor. The names are used interchangeably. Probably and most likely I will call him Edward the most often. Just because, no one's trying to read a Russian novel right now. And all the different names for one person, it's just a little confusing. And maybe nobody else finds that confusing, but I kind of did. So I think we'll call him Edward for the most part. Maybe sometimes David. I don't know what she called him. Maybe we'll find out. And just another note before I begin. I woke up this morning and my lips were so swollen. I don't know why. I didn't eat anything weird. I have been doing nothing but unpacking boxes. Is it possible for a person to have an allergic reaction to the dust? I've been sneezing nonstop, like full body sneezes. Is that why my lips are swollen? I don't know. But this Kardashian thing right here, it's not happening for me. I hate this so much. Anyway, I'm kind of glad it's a short chapter because I just can't even look at my face. I hate it. If I ever was like, I wonder if I should like go and get my lips done. I know now, no, I would never do it. Okay, let's start with the first chapter. Like I said, quite short. It's called chapter 1. It's called The Year of the Three Kings. So his father has died. He becomes king. He's king for less than a year. He's king for 326 days. And then in is ushered his brother, who they refer to as Bertie. How could you fail so colossally at a job for a woman? I don't understand this. And let's just have a little chit chat about Wallace, shall we? Wallace is like the least likely person for somebody to become completely hung up on. I don't understand the obsession with her. I don't find her strikingly beautiful. I think that potentially she had really good style. I think that people said that she was always very well dressed and well groomed. But this was a woman who craved male attention. And he was never going to be enough for her. I mean, she had multiple affairs going on at one time. And and she was married. And I just don't know. I don't know if it was like a game for him, like I want to be the one to capture her affections. I don't know what it was about this woman. I'm looking forward to learning more about her, because I don't understand why there were so many men who were willing to dance in her orbit and pin all of their affections on her. I don't understand it. And what becomes really alarming in this first chapter is how little she returned his affections. It seems like it of course boosted her ego that a crown prince and then the king would find her, to be so alluring. But once she had him, it was like she panicked, because she knew that he was doing all of this for her, and she didn't want it. She didn't want any of this. She never wanted him to leave the throne for her. She never wanted to be in his debt, because if somebody's going to give all of that away for you, then no matter how little you like him, now you got to stick around, because he gave up his entire country for you. He gave up his literal heritage for you. Now, what are you going to do? Be like, well, that was fine. Peace out. Obviously not. So I think that it's a really complicated situation. And I think this is what happens when you just let your passions blind you. Both, like for both of them, her passion to win the game completely obscured her vision of what that would really look like if she, quote unquote, did win the game and got him all in on her. And then at the same time, we're looking at him, a more obsessed man. I've never read about somebody who is so unbelievably unwilling to see reality for what it is. And it's very interesting too, because he's tempted to abandon his responsibilities for this woman. And he continues to give out, like every bit of that temptation is leading him to reduce his freedom. He thinks he's becoming more free by giving into what his heart most wants, but everything is taking him just one step further. Well, just sacrifice this little bit. Just sacrifice this little bit. Behind this door, it'll all get better. But it never really all got better. If anything, it just got worse and worse and worse. And he was pushed farther and farther and farther into this fantasy, this fairy tale fantasy that he had found, the woman of his dreams. Reality was he had found somebody who was forced to put up with him because she was obliged to. The game was only fun as long as she couldn't have him. That was why she was in it. That was the fun part. But once he gave everything up for her, and then she was basically locked inside their fake castle together for life, that wasn't the program she wanted to run. She loved being with, various men and being wined and dined and, gifts coming and the thrill of the chase is what she wanted. To actually be with him, to be his, hardly. That's not what she wanted at all. So it's just wild. It is just wild to me that either one of them found. I don't know why she didn't just leave. I do not understand that, because it's exceptionally clear in this first chapter that she was not down for whatever had just been dished out to her. Anyway, let's get started. On Friday, 11 December 1936, the final vote on the abdication bill was passed in Parliament, and Edward VIII ceased to be king. He'd reigned for 326 days. His father's premonition that within 12 months of his death his son would ruin himself had come true. What a dreadful thought to die on. Can you imagine? You're laying there dying and you know that your good-for-nothing son is coming up behind you and he's just going to ruin everything. He's just going to destroy everything you've worked for. And he must have known his son pretty well. He wasn't trying to sugarcoat anything. He predicted that boy's going to ruin himself. And subsequently, he's going to ruin the country if somebody can't, nudge him out of the way. Really, it's easy to want to be like, oh, what a horrible situation. And at the time, as we'll read, everybody was just up in arms about it, like horrified that this had come to be. Winston Churchill is said to have cried multiple times over this. And the reality is they should have been tears of joy, but they didn't know it was coming up. They had no idea that a phoenix would literally be rising from these ashes in the form of Queen Elizabeth. But who was to know that nobody could see the future. But isn't that sort of a great analogy for life? Like, so many times when you just think that everything is just, gone to, quite frankly, shit, to realize, like, I can't see around behind this corner. Like, maybe this really terrible thing has to happen so a better thing can come. I don't know. But this would certainly give that impression. Now, this next paragraph, to me, it was almost like, I don't think that an overdramatic novelist could have written anything better than this, because it's almost to the point of being ridiculous. It's just so, it's so on the nose that this is the sort of place he would live in. So Lowney goes to describe the Duke of Windsor and what he was doing on the afternoon preceding the speech he had to give on the radio. He says, the newly created Duke of Windsor spent the afternoon packing and reading letters of support and sympathy at his country house, Fort Belvedere, in Windsor Great Park. A sham Gothic royal folly, with battlements, rows of cannons, turrets, and a tower. It had been built for William, Duke of Cumberland, between 1746 and 1757, then embellished by the Regency architect Sir Geoffrey Wyatville in the reign of George IV. Okay. Is it not just too perfect that this fake person with his shallow personality should live in a house that literally reflects his superficial character? I mean, it's all just fake. A sham Gothic royal folly, it's described. And like, he's a sham folly of a king. King Edward had taken over the Grace and Favor residence in 1929, and he was later to write, the fort has been more than a home. It's been a way of life for me. I had created the fort just as my grandfather had created Sandringham. I loved it in the same way. It was there that I passed the happiest days of my life. Now, he had a guest wing added to it, but also to make this place all that it could be, he had installed central heating, ensuite bathrooms, tennis courts, swimming pool, a Turkish bath in the basement. I mean, he had really made this quite the height of luxury for its day. And I think that, again, this is, he's over here reflecting Harry and Meghan. Now, what's really interesting is he goes on to spend like bukus of money to make that place all that it could be, so that he could be living like the highest of the elites. Like just like Harry and Meghan, got to live at the greatest heights. But we're going to go on to read about a man who was so miserly with his money, it's an embarrassment. It's like a huge embarrassment how miserly he is. In the next chapter, the way he treats his hostess, as he's been kicked out of the country, it's so humiliating how little he is willing to spend in like multiple situations. He literally hands the check to somebody else and it's like, you got this right. Okay, well, he can spend just ridiculous amounts of money to make this sham Gothic royal folly of a house into this elite residence, but he, at his heart, was the greatest penny pincher that I've ever read about, like, truly. Okay, so anyway, so the real thing about this house was this house was basically like the backdrop to the life he was trying to live. This was the place where he had his private retreat, where he entertained most weekends, and where his romance had played out with the woman for whom he had given up the throne. But now he was having to leave this home that he had created, this backdrop. And his staff were also being taken from him, and he had to venture into an uncertain future. And this is where I say, there's always a promise of perfection behind every temptation. It's just always a mirage. One more sacrifice, one more compromise, and then you can have all your heart desires. So he's giving up his country, his responsibilities, his usefulness. Now he's having to give up his home, his staff, all these things for this woman who, you guys, did not want him. I cannot overestimate how little she wanted any of this. Okay, well, he's over there packing up his things and reading telegrams of affection from the few people who believed in him. At 4 p.m., Winston Churchill, who had joined him for lunch, and to help polish his speech, left the fort, his eyes filled with tears, muttering a couplet by Andrew Marvell about the beheading of Charles I. He had nothing common did or mean upon that memorable scene. But then after that, there was a dinner to say goodbye to his family. He had to say goodbye to his sister Mary and his mother, Queen Mary, widow of George V, his younger brothers Henry, Duke of Gloucester, and George, Duke of Kent, and of course Bertie, the new King George. At 7 p.m., his faithful chauffeur, George Ladbroke, drove him the 5 miles to Royal Lodge where the family had gathered. It was a strained atmosphere. Yeah, and on no small part, because he's over there just backslapping, isn't it great? Finally, I can leave. And everybody's over there literally weeping into their handkerchiefs, and he can't read the room. He's not even willing to temper his excitement, just to pump the brakes a little on it for their sake. He might be running off into the sunset as he sees it, but they've got to pick up the pieces. Bertie doesn't want to do the job. Poor man. I mean, he can't even hardly talk straight. He's got that horrible stutter. And now he's supposed to be the voice of the nation? Can you imagine the pressure on this poor man? All right, well, he shows up to the gathering, strained. Bertie was coming to terms with the responsibilities and challenges of his new role, while the rest of the royal family was still reeling from the events of the past few weeks, when David, as Edward was known to the family, had threatened to commit suicide if he could not marry the twice-divorced American, Wallace Simpson. That is so deranged. That is just so deranged. Here's the thing. Everybody knew that he was running around with her, and nobody seemed to be wanting to put the kibosh on that. Why was that not enough for him? I'm going to commit suicide if you don't let me do what I want to do. Like the oldest trick in the manipulator's book. Who have we remembered did this so very often? Meghan Markle? It's just like, that is the first resort and quite honestly the last resort of the uncreative manipulator, to just throw that one out there. But anyway, like I said, the family's reeling from the events of the past few weeks, him just like laying down the law. Well, if I can't have what I want, I'm either going to kill myself or stop being king. And so they've given him his wish. Fine, go. So he's just feeling wholly liberated, He gets to just, run out into the world with his beloved and, love conquers all, whatever comes, whatever hardships they fall on, it'll all be okay because I have you and you have me. And they have a lot of money. The new Duke of Windsor was feeling liberated. His obsession with Wallace had given him an excuse to renounce the role of king, which he had increasingly not wanted. Harry? Now, of course, Harry never had a chance at the throne, which is why his blubbering and crying about life was even worse than I would even say that David's was, because, David really did have a weight on his shoulders, and I think very few of us would really want that responsibility. Harry wanted to blubber and cry for why? Because he had a super well-off life where he got to pretty much do whatever, and then sometimes had to come out and be nice to poor people. Harry's complaints never made any sense. At least I can sort of see why David/Edward/ the Duke of Windsor was a little bit unhappy about his lot in life. But, we all need to rise to the challenges. We all have our cross to bear. And it just is like such a lame and childish excuse to be like, well, I don't want to do this. I'd rather go hang out with my girlfriend. Okay, well, anyway, he wants to go hang out with his girlfriend and doesn't want to be king anymore and just wants to go chill with her. Truly, though, they probably would have fought harder had they thought that he was going to be fit for king. In some ways, the government was only too happy for him to have this lame excuse to fall back on because they were only too excited to push him into the arms of the woman. His warm views toward the political situation in Germany was alarming, to say the least. And the government really felt like perhaps he did not have the qualities to be the monarch that they all were hoping for. So if he wants to go live in his fantasy world with his girlfriend, please do, We got to get somebody else up in here who can manage and who can stand up against the rising authoritarian power that is growling over in Germany. At 9:30 p.m., while the family was still at dinner, the lawyer Walter Monckton, Edward's trusted advisor and friend since Oxford days, arrived to escort him to Windsor Castle, where the former king was due to broadcast to the nation. They drove in silence down the long walk, Wallace's terrier Slipper on David's lap. He turned into the huge quadrangle and stopped at the Sovereign's entrance, where Sir John Reith, the Director General of the BBC, was waiting. David got out of the car, holding a cigar in one hand and slipper in the other, and introduced Monckton to Reith. Okay, can I just say for a second that I find a man wandering around with a small dog to be an abominable situation. I just find that to just be gag-worthy. A man holding a small dog, it's such an effeminate thing to do. I don't mean to hurt your feelings if you are a man with a small dog, but please don't walk around holding it. The broadcast was to be in the King's former living quarters, a small suite in the Augusta Tower, and given its size, most of the electrical equipment had to be set up in the corridor. Windsor greeted the technicians affably and went into the sitting room, where the microphone stood on the table, with a chair facing them and an evening newspaper beside them. So he had to read a couple of lines from the paper so that he could get the volumes right. It's all just very like ho-hum. Here he is renouncing his very heritage, the very reason he's on Earth. He's saying, oh, I don't want that because my girlfriend. And, he plops down, reads a couple of lines about lawn tennis. Then he pops into the bathroom, comes back out and says, guess that's the last time I'll use that bathroom. And, sits, takes his place while he waits for Reith to give a couple of opening lines about who he is and give him an introduction before he reads his bit. And it's all been choreographed. Reith speaks, slides out of the right side. He slides in on the left. He sits in front of the microphone and he reads his sorry little speech. Now let's have a listen to it. He says, "At long last, I'm able to say a few words of my own." It just smacks of selfishness. A few words of your own. All of your actions have spoken for you. We don't need you to sit down and tell us that you're leaving for your girlfriend. He praised his brother Bertie and spoke generously of the Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin. And then he said, "I found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love. I now quit altogether public affairs, and I lay down my burden. It may be some time before I return to my native land, but I shall always follow the fortunes of the British race and empire with profound interest, and if at any time in the future I can be found of service to His Majesty in a private station, I shall not fail." Well, why should we believe he would not fail in that event? Anyway, he continues, "And now we shall all have a new king. I wish him and you, his people, happiness and prosperity with all my heart. God bless you all, and God save the king." Okay, so then after that, the national anthem plays and all this. Well, I can appreciate, at the very least, that he was forced to lay down his, quote, public affairs and, as he laid down his burden. Because I think Harry and Meghan could have taken a leaf out of that book. If only they had decided to lay down all their public duties as they laid down their quote-unquote burden. I said this in that last video that I made at the very end when I was sort of talking about what we could look forward to in this book. These two, David/Edward/ the Duke of Windsor and Wallace Simpson, they sort of shine a light on how childish Harry and Meghan were in their attempt to do a similar thing. It's like Harry and Meghan, their childishness and the sloppiness of what they were trying to do is profoundly highlighted when you read somebody else's similar behavior. So he gets done with his speech. They were playing the national anthem. His lawyer, who'd been standing behind him while he was doing the broadcast, moved forward to collect the speech. And Edward laid his hand on his shoulder, saying, "Walter, it's far better thing that I go." At Chartwell, Winston Churchill, who had tried so hard to prevent the abdication, was in tears as he listened. Okay, so that's everybody else's reaction, but what's little Miss Simpson doing? What's going on with her? Well, he's over here giving his speech and eating dinner with his family and, quite frankly, being very jubilant about his release from what he sees as a prison. Well, Simpson is staying with some friends in France. She's in Cannes with friends. Listen to her words as she reminisces about having heard his speech. It says here, "I was lying on the sofa with my hand over my eyes, trying to hide my tears," she later remembered. "After he finished, the others quietly went away and left me alone. I lay there a long time before I could control myself enough to walk through the house and go upstairs to my room." She never wanted this. And in a really interesting note, in The Heart Has Its Reasons, which was written in 1956 by Michael Joseph. He had interviewed a maid who had been in the house at that time, and as she was listening to the broadcast, you know, with her hands over her eyes, hiding the tears in her eyes, she was heard muttering, "The fool, the stupid fool." I mean, could he never pick up on how much she disdained him? And that is really what we have to look forward to in the next chapter, because all of his friends who were sort of by his side as he was waiting to get married, and they weren't together at the time, like physically, they were in separate locations. His friends who happened to be around him, as he would spend every last penny making all of these really expensive international calls to her, were wondering, what's he sticking around for? That girl's real mean to him. I mean, she was always demanding, always screaming, always crying, always carrying on. And so, I mean, what it comes down to is she was outraged at the circumstances that she found herself in. But rather than blame herself, it was all on him. She was going to either drive him away from her by her meanness and cruelty. And if she couldn't do that, she was going to take out her angst on him because she was mad at herself for having found herself in this situation with this pathetic little man. You know, so that's why she was so unpleasant. But I don't understand. I mean, did he like to be screamed at? Did he like to be degraded in this way? Who even knows? Some people are weird. But I mean, I don't know what he got out of the relationship. I truly don't, unless he just loved the fantasy of it. Was he this much of a slave to his fantasy that he believed that this was a really meaningful and lovely, and like, was he some kind of romantic that he thought this was really a lovely idea? Who knows? All right, well, after he gets done with the speech, he goes back to the Royal Lodge to say goodbye to his family. Dickie Mountbatten, for whom Windsor had been best man in 1922, had driven over from the fort and remembered. Everybody was still in tears when David came in. But David was jubilant. He was like a schoolboy going off on a holiday. "It's all over," he kept saying. "It's finished, thank God." Read the room, dude. Your family's sad about this. You know, maybe you're going off to live your fantasy, but they have to. I mean, your dad just died. Like, not but like a hot second ago. So they're grieving over that. They're grieving over the fact that you can't just stand up to responsibilities, and grieving over the fact, too, that you're choosing somebody who doesn't love you. I think everybody realized that except for him. Queen Mary and the Princess Royal left first at 11:30 p.m. The politician and socialite, Chips Channon, basing his diary entry on a conversation with Monckton a few days later, wrote that Queen Mary, ever magnificent, was mute and immovable and very royal, and thoughtfully left off her mourning black for the evening, so as not to cast more gloom. So she's over there thinking of others, but God forbid Edward walk in and show even the smallest bit of care for others. Half an hour later, Windsor said his final goodbyes, and the four brothers walked to the door. The Duke of Kent, his eyes swollen from crying, sobbed, "It isn't possible. It isn't happening." George VI later remembered, "We kissed, parted as Freemasons, and he bowed to me as his king." Windsor bent over the new king and declared, "God bless you, sir. I hope you will be happier than your predecessor," and disappeared into the night, leaving the royal family speechless. So he retreats into the night so he can go get on his yacht and hang out for some time. He had a couple of people who had agreed to stay on with him. Of course, he lost all of the staff. But the keeper of the privy purse, Ulric Alexander, and his private secretary, Godfrey Thomas, and his equerry, since 1919, had decided that they would come with him and basically figure out with him what the next steps in life would look like. Also, Piers Lee had volunteered to go with him so that his former master wouldn't have to go into exile alone. So he had a small group of friends around him. Now, when Windsor crossed the gangway onto his yacht, the Fury, which he had originally wanted to call the Enchantress, and he was told, "You cannot call your yacht the Enchantress. I mean, already you're leaving us because you've been enchanted by this woman, and the whole thing is just unseemly. So no, Enchantress, not a name for your boat. It's not appropriate." With Slipper on his arm, he goes up the gangway, and he says, "I knew now that I was irretrievably on my own. The drawbridges were going up behind me." Oh, the drama. I mean, what I want to know is, that night, did he really feel the forbidding nature of what he had done? Or was he sort of enchanted by his own gall? Because I have a feeling that he thought that this was so romantic, so beautiful and lovely, that he'd followed his heart. You know, he followed his heart and did what he wanted to do. And you know what? I just couldn't care two whits about follow your heart and do what you want to do. Because that so often leads to hurt for others. I'm not saying that there is never a time when what you want to do coincides with the thing that's best for you. A lot of times that is the truth. But sometimes serving others is better than just serving your own whims. And sometimes what you think would be a sacrifice is only a sacrifice for a little while, and then you realize, actually, this is way better for me. And I wonder sometimes if Edward had bothered to lean into what had been expected of him, if he tried to see how he could make that, if he had tried to see how being useful to others is actually a blessing for yourself, if he'd ever bothered to do that. But he had resented having to be king in the first place. And then he finds this woman and he spends all of his waking minutes trying to claim her love, trying to, claim her as his own, fighting the battle to get her away from the husband, honestly, fighting the battle to keep her attention on himself. He was enthralled by that. What if he had spent that same amount of energy on trying to build his nation into all that it could be through whatever avenues were available to him as the monarch? What about that idea? Why would that not have been empowering? Because it wasn't about him. And every time we decide to just focus all of our energies on ourselves day in and day out, it just leads to greater and greater unhappiness. Because quite frankly, being ruled and reigned by your personal obsession and your selfishness is the greatest tyranny a person could ever find themselves under. We're never happy. You get one thing, you want another, you have that, it's never what you thought it was going to be. And so to constantly look to serve yourself is to commit yourself to a lifetime of prison without parole. You are the greatest tyrant you'll ever meet. So I mean, it's going to be an interesting journey. But next chapter, I'm really looking forward to that one next weekend, because it's a side to him that I didn't know. I never really liked the guy in the first place. He just always seemed like this sort of simpering fool. And I never understood why he would do what he had done. But personally, his personality is really repugnant. And his inability to read the room and his selfishness and how rude he is to his hostess, who goes out of her way on every conceivable level to take care of him. The number of times in the next chapter where he is so unbelievably penny pinching and miserly to like a shocking and embarrassing level. I did not know that side of his personality. So if you disliked him in this chapter, get ready, because you are going to find him to be absolutely horrific in the next one. All right, like I said, that was a short chapter, but I'm looking forward to next weekend. It's going to be a long episode next weekend. So, all right, I will see you guys then, and thank you so much for following me again on this new journey where we read Traitor King together. See you later. Bye.